Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for coming and making it through the crazy weather today. We really appreciate that effort and look forward to a really interesting conversation tonight. I'm Nancy Steger, President and CEO of the Eastern Bank Foundation, and I want to welcome all of you to our facilities here and to have a very interesting talk with Jeff Fuhrer, one of our foundation fellows, as well as with Bob Rivers, my boss and Chair and CEO of Eastern Bank. So we're very happy to host this. It really expresses support for Conexion and the Massachusetts Business Roundtable. And with that, let me turn it over to Phyllis Barajas, who's the Chief Grand Poobah for Conexion.
Thank you, Nancy. And I want to thank Eastern Bank, first of all, for having faith in Conexion and our work, and Nancy Steger in particular. Nancy has been with us since day one of Conexion, which speaks volumes to the values of Eastern Bank before, current, and I hope into the future. So thank you, Eastern, and thank you, Bob, for your support as well. I also want to thank J.D. Chesloff, and I want to say a little bit about Mass Business Roundtable and our relationship, because I think it's an important example. Conexion is really about, actually what is in Jeff's book, is about the need for us to come together and to work together to make for a better future, because it's a shared future for all of us. So I want to acknowledge Mass Business Roundtable, because we're more than just hosting, but it's really about the work that we've been doing now for 3 years. And a quick story, I can't help myself. Several years ago, I guess it was 2021, we had been doing some sessions with Mass Business Roundtable and Conexion to bring the two networks together, Mass Business Roundtable and our Conexion network of Latino professionals and businesses. And I said to JD, I said, I have this really amazing person who's one of our mentors, and he's a macroeconomist. And I said, he's working on, socioeconomic apartheid, and that's my word, okay? And I said, I think he has something to share. And then I told Jeff that JD liked the idea, and then Jeff says, oh no, I can't do it, they'll just fall asleep, because then he only had slides, he didn't have the book that he has now. Anyway, long story short, he came, he did the presentation in December. I didn't know that Bob Rivers didn't know him in that way, and Bob was so impressed, he introduced him to Nancy, and the rest is history. So Conexion is matter, and thank you, Jeff, for the work that you've done. I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy this evening's presentation and his book, The Myth That Made Us. Thank you.
So what was the impetus for you? Why did you go in this direction?
So one of the things I try to emphasize in the book is that for me and for all of us, it's a journey. It's something that's going on for a long time. And I actually was first exposed to some of these issues when working at the Fed. For a while, I had oversight of the Regional and Community Outreach Group, which is a terrific group. And they were working on a variety of things, including producing the study, The Color of Wealth, that came out in 2015. Many of you, if not all of you, have seen it. That was one influential experience for me, where it became clear to me that the stories I had as a mainstream economist about why we see disparities in income and wealth were at best incomplete and at worst just off the mark. But I would say in addition, I had the privilege of working with the folks who crafted the so-called Working Cities project, which became the Working Communities project. And as part of that, we traveled around to the lowest income communities in New England, the 6 states of New England. And I got to sit down with folks, both residents and their representatives, just to talk about and listen to, importantly, what life is like. And there's some other things too, but those early exposures through the Fed work changed my mind about how the world works and made me realize that I need to learn some more. That I didn't learn from my Harvard PhD. I did not learn that, but I had to learn more. And so I set about, both through my work, real life experience, and reading and talking to folks who are already experts in these areas, some of whom I reference in the book, just taught me invaluable lessons about the way the economy has been shaped, structured designed consciously over the centuries to produce the kinds of outcomes that we see today, so many of which I think are just completely unacceptable.
Yeah. As another example of life comes full circle, it was actually the Colorado Wealth report done by the Fed in 2015, which was the inspiration for us to focus our foundation on issues of economic inclusion and mobility. So very much appreciate that work and the ongoing work to update it now that I know you're heavily involved with, as well as part of our team.
Yeah. And I do want, I have to thank the foundation because they paid for me while I was working on this book. I got up every morning. It was my job to sit down and research and write the stuff that became the book. And so I really appreciate that opportunity.
So tell us about the myth. So you said the book is called The Myth That Made Us.
Yes.
And the myth is about many different elements that sort of led to the structure of the economy that we have today and the ways in which it disadvantages certain communities. So tell us a little bit about that.
So the myth is made up of a few different narratives that I think you'll mostly recognize. They're sort of part of our national DNA at this point. They're sort of in the air we breathe and the water we drink in a lot of ways. So the four most important parts of the myth, four most important narratives that form the myth are, one, the self-made man, or the meritocracy, or we all just need to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps narrative. That's very deep in our culture, in part because we'd like to believe it's true. Aspirationally, I'd like to believe that if you work hard, you will succeed. Factually, that is not true for so many folks. So that's the first one. The second is that we're a post-racist nation, right? Another one that I suppose is aspirational. It's just not accurate. There are folks who want to say that all of the effects of those centuries of systemic discrimination are behind us. They don't affect outcomes today, and we shouldn't be talking about them anymore. People actively trying to discourage discussion, teaching of the history, now eliminating DEI programs in various forms. That is a really important myth, because when you combine the post-racist notion with the first one, what it says is the reason that we see disproportionately poor outcomes for families of color is because they're disproportionately bad at working hard. They're somehow lazier than everybody else. Well, that's incredibly corrosive and disrespectful. So those two together are important enough. I would add two others. One is the narrative about what it is that businesses are responsible for. And starting way back, but an important capstone there was Milton Friedman in 1970, a brilliant economist. He did a little damage with this statement I'm going to tell you about. Brilliant economist, but the statement was the responsibility for corporations, and really I'm talking about large corporations here, is to maximize shareholder value, which is equivalent to just maximizing profits ruthlessly, and nothing else. Full stop. That's all you should be doing. Not important for you to worry about what your impact on the environment is, what your impact on your community is, what your impact on your employees is. In fact, he said that concern for those things, the quote is tantamount to socialism. Now, those are fighting words in 1970. They're still fighting words today. So he just said that you have to, and companies took that maxim and took it to its absurd extreme. So that today, companies, large corporations, are making record-breaking profits, even as they don't pay all of their workers enough to survive and don't provide benefits that would help them to survive. And as they make those record-breaking profits, over 40% of those profits last year were used to repurchase their own shares, to bid up the stock price again because they're worried about shareholders. Well, I'll tell you, so that 40%, that's over $1 trillion in 2022, a little more than that in 2023. I've got better uses for that $1.1 trillion than repurchasing stocks. I can think pretty quickly of good things to do with that. The final narrative that matters is, what is the role of government in all this? And the glib answer is to stay out of the way and let free markets function as they're supposed to. The reason that's glib is because the government has never stayed out of the way and let free markets operate. There's no such thing as a free market in the United States or around the world. They're all designed. They're supported by government in many, many ways. And what I just mentioned about this, the use of profits to buy up to bid up share prices, rather than to pay living wages and benefits is actually an example of a way in which the government interferes, because it's an implicit subsidy by the government to the largest corporations to pay for those things that allow people to survive when the largest corporations don't provide those things for their employees. That is far from the only way that the government is involved. Tax rates, keeping them low, subsidies of various kinds for industries that do harm. The government has always been involved in our economy. There are no free markets. The question is, how is the government involved and to whose benefit? And that, I think, that narrative needs to change, because there are ways the government can be involved. We actually have the resources to do something better for more folks in the economy who are not being provided opportunity.
So how do you change the narrative?
I'll give you a shorter answer next time.
No, but there's a lot to no, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm sure as the audience thinks about this, you may have some questions and responses. So, as you were talking about capitalism, as we currently constructed it here in the United States, I was reminded of Milton Friedman's experiment in Chile, which was capitalism on steroids, which didn't work out so well.
Not so well.
But capitalism does work in other countries, albeit in different ways. So what examples have you seen where it works better than it does here?
Yeah, and first, you mentioned a really important point, which is that capitalism is not an organic system that just grows. You put it in a petri dish and it grows and it turns into capitalism. It's the same everywhere. That's not what happens. We have constructed, I think you said plus or minus, a particular form of capitalism. And so to your question, when we look around the world at other countries that are also capitalist countries, we don't see the same set of outcomes. We also don't see the same adherence to these elements of the myth in those countries as we do in the US. So, for example, when asked, why is it that people don't succeed in an economy? In the US, 60% of respondents in the survey say laziness. In other countries in Europe, the UK, Sweden, France, so on, maybe 20% say that. They have a very different view of what it is in their capitalist system that causes bad outcomes. And what they would say, they more often say, it's bad luck or bad initial conditions or lack of opportunity. And we don't say that in the US. Why? Because we believe so deeply in this, you can work hard and succeed. That's our national DNA. We're the land of opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. We believe in it. We want to believe in it. Unfortunately, because it's not true, that's been extremely destructive. The sorts of outcomes that you see, in addition to the different beliefs about how the economy works in other countries, are that inequality of income and wealth is less in those countries. Healthcare outcomes are better in those countries, right? We're the richest country in the world by most measures. Our health outcomes are worse. Educational outcomes are not as good. Boy, Michelle Alexander wrote a book about, so you can easily write a book about the prison system. We are a complete outlier with respect to prison experiences in the United States. Those things are all the result of conscious choices that we have made, fueled by those narratives, to structure an economy that delivers really good stuff to a subset of people. Large, successful corporations, very wealthy individuals, disproportionately white folks. That's the way it is structured. So you don't need to look far, look across the ocean to see different outcomes in capitalist economies. And the one final thing I would add is mobility. If it were the case that low income and low wealth were a transitory phenomenon for some families, I still wouldn't be happy with it, but I'd feel better knowing that on average, let's say, they're going to move up over time. In the US, that is not true. It is quite rare. Of course, you probably all know some people who have succeeded, but writ large, looking at the data, the overall distribution of outcomes, it's really uncommon for people to move up in terms of income and less common to move up in terms of wealth. Other countries, that is much more common. So that means these are not just temporary circumstances that are regrettable. They're, in many cases, most cases, lifelong circumstances.
So those differences, that lack of advancement, is certainly a product of the mindset, as you mentioned, but it's also a function of barriers that exist. Mm-hmm. And what are some of the barriers you see in our system that perhaps don't exist or exist to a lesser degree in other places?
So one of the fascinating barriers is, yeah, it's a barrier, is it turns out, maybe not surprisingly, that in the US particularly, the specific conditions that you start out with at birth are very strong determinants of whether you're likely to succeed. That is less so in other countries. That's part of the mobility story. There's terrific research that shows that if you grow up in a particular neighborhood in Mobile, Alabama, I'm just taking it, the research is not about Mobile, Alabama, but for example, a particular neighborhood in Mobile, Alabama, that's just a few hundred yards away from another one, your income 35 years later could be 6 times lower than the person who grows up in that neighborhood. Now, on average in Alabama, incomes are considerably lower than they are for kids who grow up in Massachusetts. So both at the state level and at the very local neighborhood level, these localized conditions, which have to do with public safety and schools, whether there's education accessible, parental expectations, all sorts of things, have a huge influence on people's ability to succeed. Why is that? The fundamental barrier is lack of opportunity. Kids who don't get a chance to get a decent education, you would think in the United States, after the public school reforms of the earlier 20th century, that would be the norm. It is not. Kids who don't get a chance to get a basic education, kids whose families have little resources to buffer against the vicissitudes of personal, economic, and financial lives, kids who don't have access to good preventive, formative health care early on in life are much less likely to succeed. And those are the sorts of initial conditions that prevail in the lowest income, disproportionately community of color neighborhoods in the United States. So lack of opportunity is the biggest barrier. What people want to say is it's lack of effort. Those kids don't work hard. Those kids don't go after it. They're not persistent. They don't have the grit that it takes to succeed. Well, most of the people, maybe all of the people in this audience, know that's just patently false. Why? Because you know people who live in such circumstances. If you're lucky, they used to live, but by and large, live and continue to live in those circumstances. What do I know from meeting people during my years at the Fed, going out into neighborhoods to talk to people in low-income neighborhoods, and also in interviewing the folks who are in this book, which is a critical part of what's in the book? What I know is this: people of low income are incredibly hardworking, incredibly resourceful, incredibly determined against the odds. Why are they so hardworking and determined and resourceful? Why are they such good budgeters, for example? Because they have to be to survive. They can't throw money, or they can't misplace money or misuse it. The notion that aid that goes to lower income families goes to gambling and alcohol and drugs has been disproved over and over again in the research. What do people who get income aid spend it on primarily? Food, number one. Diapers. Diapers not a small thing for families with kids. The basic necessities of life. So that lack of opportunity is what I try to address when I talk about how to solve this in the book. Because we have the wherewithal to provide more opportunity, more equally. We do. We choose not to, because we keep saying the poor are not like us. The poor don't work as hard as we do. There are deserving poor and undeserving poor. That narrative goes back to the 16th century in Europe and perpetuated through the United States in the formation of the Republic in the early 19th century. It's all over the writing, it's all over the experience, and it's all over our legislation. We don't trust the poor. As recently as the pandemic, when people were unemployed, out of work because the economy had to be shut down during the pandemic, there were debates about whether we could extend unemployment insurance. Why? Well, they're just going to stay on unemployment insurance and not work. There was research done to show in the data, but you also know from talking to people, no one is so dumb as to not take a good job that will be with them for 2, 4, 7, 10 years because they'll get an extra month or two of unemployment insurance. People get that having stable employment is the key to economic and personal stability. It's not like people don't understand that. And yet our politicians were debating, well, could we extend unemployment insurance a little more because the incentives go the wrong way. Boy, I'm so tired of hearing that phrase. So Those are the primary
Yeah.
barriers. They're about opportunity, and they're so entrenched in initial conditions, where you happen to be born, what your parents' economic circumstances are, and so on.
So let's switch to some
Mhm.
solutions, and I'll start
Yeah.
with some ideas you have for government, whether that be city, state, federal. Um, then we'll go to the private sector,
Yeah.
and then I'd like to go to everyone here in the audience. Those that are here, those that are watching online. What can we do? Because it's not just institutional solutions that are important, because institutions are made up of individuals, of
Yeah.
course. So, government, what are some examples of things you think government could do or has done actually to address income inequality, wealth inequalities, et cetera?
All of that. So some governments have, although it's not widespread enough, but some governments have been successful in more uniformly providing early childhood education. It's one of the first ones, right? And why is that? Because the medical research, the economic research, the social research all shows, and anyone who knows kids knows, that those early years for kids are so critical in terms of development. Without good support, they may recover, but they may not. It is certainly much harder. Even more importantly, what we know from those local governments mostly, there's some states that are doing, a few states, a handful of states who are doing a good job on this. We know from their experience is that the returns to providing high quality early childhood education for kids essentially starting at birth up through age 5, the returns are enormous. It's expensive. It costs $22,000 a year per kid to pay for high quality early childhood education. Great. But what you make back in terms of improved earnings, healthcare outcomes, much reduced interaction with the criminal justice system, and so on, is 6 times that amount. So if you had an investment you could put in the bank and it would earn you 6 times over a span of 25 years, you'd probably do that. As a country, it's kind of a shame that we don't do that. What I would say about state and local versus federal is this. Too much, I really alluded to this already, too many of the outcomes in our society are due to the lottery of life, the chance of life, the luck of personal circumstances. And while I would applaud any state or locality that moves forward on early childhood education, still what it means is kids who don't happen to be born in that state due to the luck of birth, the accident of birth, don't get those benefits. So what I'd love to see is to make that a national standard. Not because I'm in favor of the federal government doing everything just because, but because I don't want all of these outcomes to be determined by these lotteries of life, the circumstances of birth. So early childhood is the first one.
Mhm.
And I'll just mention one other because I could go on
Yeah.
all day and I won't. One other is that community colleges are a terrific resource in our country. More than 40% of students who are educated after secondary school are educated in our community colleges. They're chronically underfunded. They're full of people who really want to help. They don't always have the resources. Again, there are good examples, although it's not widespread, of community colleges with programs such as a pipeline program whereby the community college often connects with a kid in high school, may give them some preliminary training to make sure they can go into the community college, get the training they need that is targeted for a specific job down the pipeline at a private employer who actually has openings. So it takes uncertainty out of this economic pathway. And those kids who go through those programs get a job that pays a good livable salary, not $15 an hour with $30,000 a year is tough to live on. Certainly, a single person, it's tough. If you have a family, it's impossible. But higher wages, considerably higher wages than that, which transform not only those kids, but their families, because often they'll be the only stable, sustainable earning source in the family. So those are 2 examples. We can talk more about a precursor for all of the prerequisite for all those, which is how do we change, and Reed and I were talking about this before, but how do we change the narratives that have gotten us here? Because they're still operating all over the place in our country today. But
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
So when it comes to the private sector,
Yeah.
businesses, what can businesses do? What have you seen, businesses do to address this? Present company excluded, because
Well, I was going to start with present company because it's not a bad example. No, I'm not saying this because
I think they're great examples. It just might seem to the audience a little
well, so I'll
self-serving.
say it. No, you don't need to say it. I'll say it. I knew something about Eastern Bank and the foundation before coming in. Since coming, this is what I see. I see that the leadership that includes Bob and his predecessor and the predecessor before that, but they have created a culture of a private sector enterprise that cares about the community, that does not put profit only first. Profit matters, obviously, but it does not put profit only first and cares about the community, and not just through the terrific work of the foundation, that's important, but it's imbued in every employee who comes in the door. And when you talk to employees who work for Eastern Bank, they love working for it because they see the public missions that you're essentially involved in. So you didn't need to say that. I'm saying it. He didn't pay me to say that. I think that's true. So there's a good example right in this building. And there are other corporations who do that kind of work and imbue that sort of culture among their employees, among their workforce. But they're not in the majority. And so what I have the Mass Business Roundtable, the National Business Roundtable, have said things about we need to change our business models. Jamie Dimon, when he was running this back in 2019, I think, said, that old model of ruthless profit maximizing isn't working so well in a lot of ways. We need to re-examine that. How much change has happened? This is not about MBR, but at the national level, how much change has happened after that? Not that much. There's a few people who have said a few things, not putting their money where their mouth is. I would love to see, for sure, some of our large business leaders take the messages that I'm talking about and many other people have talked about to heart and say, we've got the wherewithal. We have these massive profits. We've got the leeway to do things somewhat differently. Let's do that, and let's do it together so it isn't as much a competitive thing that you have to move first, which could be to your competitive disadvantage. I don't know if that's going to happen. I'd love to see it if it did. If that didn't happen, what I'd love to see is some president of the United States bring a couple of these folks into the Oval Office and just say, look, you knuckleheads, we've been doing this for way too long, the way you're doing it now. That game is over. It's going to change. The easy way is for you guys to take the lead and do it. The hard way is we're going to make you do it. We are going to change the corporate tax structure. We're not going to allow you to offshore earnings that are making other people pay for your tax burden, and those are often people who are middle income and lower. We're not doing that anymore. If you have profits as reported, we're going to tax them unless you decide to do something better with them. That is, to pay wages that are sustainable, to pay benefits that are life-sustaining, healthcare, and so on.
Is
So
that
they
part
have
of
a
the
role
key
to
in other
play.
countries? Is
Say
that part of the key in other countries? Their tax rates are high.
Well, and I don't want to turn this into a socialist country. Everybody says, oh my God, oh my gosh, what would happen? It's like, well, these are labels. It is part of the key because there's more of a basic floor of existence that's provided in other countries. They do that in part by taxing and using it to provide really vital benefits, education, healthcare, and so on. I doubt we're going to become Sweden in the United States. And maybe we don't want to be, I don't know. But I do think the notion that at the national level, we ensure a basic level of survival, education, healthcare, housing. There's people who, are you kidding me? This country in the aggregate is so there are people who don't have houses. There are 7 million. We are missing 7 million affordable housing units for those who fall into the extremely low income category. That's just for the extremely low income category. For the low income, it's another few million houses. Houses we don't have. They have not been constructed. We should put programs in place that put people in a better position to get into a house. But unless the houses are there, it ain't going to solve the problem. We need to dramatically change supply. A lot of that has to do with zoning. Massachusetts in the lead in some respects there. They've actually made some zoning changes. It is interesting to see pushback from some communities who are wealthy communities saying, well, we can't have that happen. I had an interesting question at the book launch that Eastern put together over at City Space, which was a terrific event, and I will thank you again for that, because I'm just not used to that kind of treatment, honestly. Like being a celebrity, it was great. But the question came from a good friend of mine, Lachlan Farrow, who's a doctor at Mass General, has been for a long time, and has been incredibly active in all kinds of social justice here and around the world. he asked a question about Newton, which he said was pushing back on some of these things. And he said, what would you say, Jeff, to a Newton resident who's pushing back on the MBTA-based development initiatives? And I said, I would say two things. And I hope these were the right answers. I don't know. We'll find. I would say two things. One is this. We have a chronic shortage of affordable housing. Altruistically, wouldn't you, as a relatively affluent resident of Newton, like to be part of the solution? Wouldn't you like that? Wouldn't that at least make you feel good if you need to have that motivation to do something good? But as importantly, and this one is, look, I'm an economist. What do I know about this stuff? This is about relationship and social dynamics and people. Every time and I think most everyone I know, comes in contact with, builds relationship with people who are different from them, they are enriched, they learn, they benefit. Your community in Newton will be so much better for having built new relationships with people who won't be able to afford to live there otherwise. And that, you will see over time, will be a tremendous benefit to your community, certainly for the people who get affordable housing. But for everyone who lives there now, your lives will be changed all for the better. Now, afterwards, he sent me an email and he said, Jeff, that was exactly the right answer. And I said, okay, Dr. Fuhrer graded me, gave me an A on that one. As squishy as it may feel, I think that's a big part of the path forward is we need to know each other better. We need to take opportunities to build relationships with folks who are not like us. Through my mentoring relationships, I've been given that gift. It's helped me understand things I would never know from my own particular perspective and perch. These are gifts. Bringing people together who are different in all sorts of ways, it's a gift. And the more we understand that, the better our society will be. And right now, people are screaming at each other for political reasons. They don't even understand half the time why they're yelling at each other. They don't. But they don't know each other, I know that. And if they did, we might have some conversations.
Yeah, good.
So,
Couldn't
yeah,
agree more.
so anyway.
So back to all of us here in the audience. So what can we do to address these myths, address these barriers, change that dynamic? Because again, institutions,
Yep.
whether they be government or private sector, have lots of resources to do that and should. But it all starts with us as members of those organizations, as members of our community.
Right.
So what can we do?
So when I was speaking about this to anyone who would listen before the holidays, probably some of them were, I go into the holidays, can you stop talking now? What I said before the holidays is, we have opportunities coming up in the next few weeks, but it's still true today, that we're going to go to various places that we're connected to through our families. Or maybe it is our families, because I don't know about your family. Not everybody in my family thinks exactly the same way I do. They don't all vote the same way I do. Okay, that's an opportunity for a conversation. So within families, but more importantly, people often say, well, we are too segregated economically, socially, and racially to build relationships with these folks. And that reflects a fact about our economy. We have chosen to segregate ourselves largely in that way. However, by and large, we work with, in the companies we work in are generally somewhat more diverse. There are opportunities within our workplace. There are opportunities with people that we interact with in healthcare, hospitality, agriculture, but in a bunch of major industries that are not all white, rich folks, where there are opportunities to build relationships if we take the time to do that. And I think that's a call to action for everybody in your personal lives. If you do that, again, it's enriching, I hope, for both sides, just to have contact between people who don't have the same perspective.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to do. There are other things like, please vote. And when you vote, whatever the scale is, contact your representative, but at least vote for folks who are talking about primarily these issues, not distraction issues. These issues of economic opportunity and climate change are actually existential for our country. That word is overused, but I think for both of those cases, they are. We won't survive very well if we continue to have a large swath of individuals, families, who are never provided the opportunity to succeed and as a consequence are doing really poorly. We're not going to succeed because those folks are not happy with it. They shouldn't be. I will add, and please don't take this the wrong way, that while the folks who are suffering are disproportionately families of color, there's a whole bunch of white folks who are poor out there too who are not doing well. It's not been my focus to champion that cause, but we care about poor white folks who are not doing well too. They matter. And I have to say, as a political strategy, whoever gets their attention, not sure my favorite party has their attention right now, but whoever gets their attention will do a few good things. One, they will help alleviate suffering among poor folks of whatever race, ethnicity, or geographic location. And two, they will attract a large voting base, which will get them elected. And three, for the first good reasons, the country will be better off as a consequence. So we have work to do.
Yep.
It's advocacy, it's voting, and it's focusing on the right issues, not which bathrooms kids go to.
Yeah. Yep. So, you mentioned that you learned a lot of this through personal experience in your own life, in your own family, and by touring places like Lawrence and other gateway cities, and doing interviews as part of your work at the Fed. And you've done a number of interviews as part of this book. Is there one or two that really stand out to you that when you met this individual and heard their story really struck you as most powerful in sort of driving you forward?
So I'll mention two. Is that okay?
That's I said. Is it two? Is it a
You
couple?
said two.
I said a
could do
couple. I said a
Okay.
couple.
All right. I just want to follow the rules here. So first, there were actually three women who were recent emigres from Central America who had been escaping gangs who had murdered family members. It's hard for me to imagine what that's like, but I heard it and I sat across the table. I did those interviews in person. The first thing I want to say is this. Those folks are working incredibly hard. They're doing everything they can to survive in this country, often with hanging in the balance immigration status, not because they're trying to be illegal, but because their cases are waiting to be heard in court and it takes so long. And okay, they're doing everything they can. Second, they were incredibly generous. Here's some guy, some tall white guy, shows up, he's writing a book, so what? And I want you to tell me your life story. And those life stories were hard. I mean, they were reliving fairly recent trauma like I have never
Why
seen.
did they agree to meet with you and tell you?
Good question, because I had a bridge through an organization, in this case, La Colaborativa. I had a bridge because I had done some work with them before, and I asked if they would be willing to make the contacts, because without that, I don't think those people would have trusted me. So in almost every case,
Right.
and some of the people are in the audience today, they helped make connections, a connection of trust between me. Yes, I'm trustworthy, but you don't know me, so how could you? And an organization that they trusted, which made that connection possible. So that's a great question. But they were incredibly generous, sharing these just unbelievably traumatic experiences like I have never been through. And they allowed me to reflect those experiences in the book so that people could hear what that is like. What is that like? And what are they doing to succeed here? And what are the barriers they face? And the second one I'll just talk about is someone who was a single mother with 4 kids whose annual income was $10,000 a year, actually slightly under $10,000 a year. Try to think about living on $10,000 a year in the Boston metro area. It's not possible. Now, she had some assistance. She had food stamps or SNAP now. She had some housing assistance, utility assistance, but she was negotiating all of the cliffs and triggers of those supports that mean that if you do the wrong thing, you lose the utility assistance or the housing voucher or whatever. She, despite the fact that she had those incredibly meager resources and significant needs for her trying to support her kids, she somehow carved out time to give back to her community. She was volunteering for voter registration. She was volunteering for the diaper bank. And so, if it were me, I think I'd be huddled in my bunker trying to make things work as best as possible. But she did all that and gave back to her community. And she said, I didn't prompt her for this. She said, people think that we don't try. We folks who are lower income folks don't try. She She says, I tried. I really tried, and I'm still trying. I put that as a quote in the book because it's a quote, and it kind of summarizes the distinction between what people think, that is, they're not trying hard enough, and the reality, you better believe they're trying. Put trivially, laziness is equally distributed across income deciles. Proportionately, there are as many lazy poor people as there are lazy rich people. It is not laziness that leads to large swaths of poverty in the United States. Yes, there are some lazy poor people, and I've met some really lazy rich people. They fell into a fortune, or they won the lottery on their business got sold. Are they hardworking? Yeah, but so are all these other people who have nothing. It is not laziness that determines things. So anyway, she said this quote. I thought it was spot on. There are other folks who basically said back to me the things I wanted to write, eloquently in my book, but they said them even better.
Mhm.
And without my telling them what to say, they just said the main themes of the book right back to me. And so I wrote them down. I said, well, that makes my job easier, but it's also much more powerful to hear them from the people who live that experience than it is to hear it from me. Sorry about that, guys in the back. Sorry, apologize. Whack.
So
Much more
let
powerful.
me ask you this. I got one more question for you, and then we're going to turn it over to the audience or anyone online who has a question. So what fell on the cutting room floor? There's a lot in the book, right? And I'm sure there was a lot that you felt like you couldn't fit in. Maybe it's part of the next book. So what are some of those other thoughts that aren't in the book that maybe you're thinking about for the future?
Well, most of the stuff that fell out of the book probably should have fallen out of the book because, as you said at the beginning, I eat data for breakfast. Right? I'm just a huge consumer of data. And I had another 50 charts, literally, in the original book. Because they didn't tell me at first that there was a limit. There's 25 was the limit, so I had to cut 50. I cut 50 charts out. So there's lots more data to support what I'm saying. I don't think that's necessary. I think
Yeah.
from the 7 of you who've read the book, I think the book makes its point just fine. One of the things I'm working on right now, which is alluded to briefly in the book, but I'm going into in more detail, is understanding how many folks in our country really are struggling to survive. And the most common way of describing that is say, well, who's below the poverty level? Well, to me, that's just utterly uninformative. The poverty level for the United States, they don't do it by region, for a family of 4, as of now, is $31,000. That's the poverty level. So how do you know what it takes to live in any given place in the United States? Well, interestingly, there are people working on that. I'm one of them now. So an organization in DC put together budgets. They're sort of bare bones budgets. What does it take to survive for a given family structure in a given county in the United States? You have to have a roof over your head. You need food. You need health care of some sort, although they skinny that down. You often need transportation to get to work, but they don't include, this is not budget that lets you go on vacations or take other trips or just basic transit and, clothing and so on. So basic necessities. What do I find when I use that? So then I use that data to match it up with families, the total resources available to them, all the income they earn, plus any supports they get from the government, either in cash or in kind. Add all that up, and then county by county, match up for that specific family, who's making at least that basic necessities budget and who's not. So this is what I've been working on. And the answer is, I presented this at Harvard and they said, that can't be right. It was 45% of families in the United States, 45%. Actually, another group did this study just for the Los Angeles County. They came up with 51% in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is different, and it differs around the country. The folks at Harvard said, well, that can't be right. And I said, well, why not? I don't know, it just sounds too high. It's like, it sounds too high to me too, that's why I'm writing about it. And I went back and reviewed and I said, no, these are carefully constructed, but this is like the FDA thrifty food budget. It's the fair market rental values for homes in different, for rental homes in places around the country, which varies. You just can't live for $25,000 or $30,000 with a family of 4. You could barely live as a single person. So when I do that, to me, this is the shocking fact that matched up pretty carefully in that way. 45% of families are not making it. For families of color, it's over 50%. Okay. this is like where the alarm bells go off, right? This is where that submarine thing that goes, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh. There is water leaking into the vessel and we're underwater and that's not good. You're going to die. This is a problem. How could it be in the country that is as affluent and wealthy as ours is, that fraction of families doesn't have enough to make it? Well, as I said, we created that, fueled by these narratives. That's why the work to be done that provides better opportunity has to begin really soon, because those families are struggling, struggling, struggling. And that's just the fraction so some of those are near the border of making it, but a bunch of them are far from making it. And that's after they get government assistance, So that's one of the
Yeah,
things
yeah.
that,
Look forward to it. I
yep.
look forward to the work. So, take a couple questions from the audience or from online. Anyone have any questions for Jeff about? All right, go ahead.
Yeah, first I want to thank you for writing this book. I think it really essentially makes an incredible data-informed case, right, for what's happening. Right, we have false narratives in an increasingly disinformation-laden age. Right, how do we sort of, but the data case is really important because ultimately everyone wants to see the data case. But where I've come to, so I've come out of, I don't know, all my life anti-poverty work. And I'm probably one of the 1%, daughter of factory workers who grew up in Lawrence, Mass. My parents are Cuban immigrants. They came in '69, back when we had local production with, decent, jobs
Yep.
where you could buy a home. We're not in that space right now. Ultimately, where I've landed is, I think narrative shift is very important, because without the narrative shift, you have people in influential positions who keep creating the same reality, and we also keep funding, uh, the symptoms. Like, I run a small nonprofit where we spend so much of our time, like a lot of nonprofits, putting band-aids on the symptoms that we don't get to the origins, which are narrative shift. And how do you elevate those stories? How do you tell those stories compellingly? How do you use those stories for positive change and to influence systems? So I'm really interested in sort of doing that thinking, like, and I also think some of the challenges are that um that we rely on media for narrative, and media is very compromised. So my question to you is, how do we really push forward new narratives that move away from meritocracy, that really enrich people's knowledge about those vicissitudes of poverty? And how do we do it in an age that's driven by disinformation, where media is no longer independent, beyond sort of, relationship? Because I do agree with you, the relationship building and really creating spaces for conversations are really important.
So I'm optimistic about the populace of the United States. I don't think they believe a lot of the stuff that they parrot back. It's just what they've heard through their siloed news channels. Because when you talk to people in neighborhoods, they'll take care of each other. They care about building community. They care about basic human stuff. But then they go listen to some of the news channels that are just telling them hateful things and divisive things and othering things. It's us and them and all that. So I think the people actually are ready for a narrative that's more inclusive and community building. We talked a little bit about the relationship building. Like, I think the courageous leaders who can call out these narratives, even if it means they don't get elected next time, hey, that's the way it goes, right? But call out the narratives and say, look, this just isn't true. We have to accept that, and then we need to figure out what to do about it. I also think, though, that there are policies for which the narrative can be recast so that it's more palatable to everyone. So when I talked about early childhood education, who's going to say that every kid in the United States doesn't deserve an opportunity to succeed? Tell me you're going to vote against, and some knucklehead will, of course. But on the face of it, that is a big tent policy. Early childhood education is good for everyone. The way I propose it is everybody gets it, but you pay for it yourself if you can afford it. My family would have paid for it ourselves. Families that can't afford it get it paid for, period. But who's going to say that they shouldn't have an opportunity? So start with kids. because it's a soft spot in our hearts. I would go much further than that, but it's a good place to start. Start with, we haven't talked about wealth redistribution because it's so ticklish. You know, the reparations word is the one everybody, I had some really interesting emails from some people who are expressing their opinions to me. And, you know, I actually tried to engage some of them. But I understand there are people who really get upset about that. Baby bonds. It's another way of redistributing wealth. Why would that be more palatable? Because it is one that's addressed to whoever has low income and wealth. And that will disproportionately be Black and Hispanic and some Southeast Asian families, and God help us, indigenous people. That's a whole nother set of books, right? What happened there. So baby bonds that deposit money into accounts based on lack of resources, income, and wealth is a big tent policy that could succeed in part for that reason. So there's much more to talk about there, but those are a couple of ideas for how to move forward. Yes, change narratives, and then also recast the narrative around policy so that they draw people in this big tent sort of fashion, but actually get the job done. Because of course, automatically, Black and brown folks will disproportionately get deposits because they have lowest wealth in the country. Done.
So we have time for one more question. We're actually, this is like live television. We're going to go to commercial at 7 o'clock. So so we got time for one more question if anyone has a question. Online.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the moderation. I'm curious, and I apologize in advance. I have not read the book. I would love to now that I've learned more about it. If you, in the book or just through your own reflection, have come up with a list of myths based off of your research for other countries that you would propose for the United States, as we start to transition from the way that we think now to the way that we could think moving forward, that would be more progressive and useful for us.
So sort of new set of myths that would help us move forward.
Yes, sir.
Whether they come from other countries or somewhere else. Yeah, I haven't done enough research to say something really compelling about that for the other countries, historical myths and so on. However, folks in the UK, the UK has pluses and minuses. The folks in the UK don't say, by and large, that National Health Service thing where you get health, everybody gets health care. Why are we giving that to? They just they've absorbed that ethos, right? That's part of the way they think about the world. Folks in the Scandinavian countries think about parenthood differently. You got kids. If you're a mother or a father, you get 1 or 2 years off with your job held for you, right? Not just good luck when you come back, but we're holding your job for you for 1 or 2 years. Well, that says something about the importance of raising kids, giving them a good early childhood foundation, keeping the family stable, but keeping your earnings stable as well. That's part of their culture that they just don't even think about. It's just the way they do things. Now, to my ear, some of this boils down to whether we think about ourselves as a large community or as a bunch of individual strivers. And that's another part of our DNA. Individual success and accomplishment is highly prized in the United States. We are a tournament, generally speaking, country. Now, there are times where that works well, the Olympics, but in a lot of other circumstances, the failure to see the benefits of being a community-based country are significant, and they're in some ways at the heart of these narratives. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps, individual achievement. Corporations are there to succeed at all costs. They don't worry about their employees, it's just making sure their stock price is super high, because that means they win the tournament. This failure to see that we're in this together, and that's true for climate as well as economics, is a fundamental failure in the US. Not that there aren't great things going on here. Of course there are. Somebody heard my book and said, "You hate the United States." I said, "No, I don't. I live here. I love it. But I want to do things better because I think that's our responsibility. Where we're falling down, it's our job to figure out, to point that out and to do better." So that's at the heart of some of the changes, is thinking about us, not us and them.
So Jeff, first of all, thanks again for writing the
Sure.
book. Thanks for the opportunity to spend
for the
this time
support
with you.
so I could do it.
Thanks to all of you for being here for this conversation. For those of you who are here in person, Jeff will be around for a while to answer any other questions that you have. On your way out, we do have a book. So if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, you'll get a chance on your when you get home, because we have a book for each of you that's here. And again, Jeff, thank you so much. Thanks
Second
again,
prize
everyone.
is 2 books.